So today on this session, we'll be discussing disarming disinformation, defending the truth in a digital age. Undoubtedly, one of the biggest challenges facing the modern world is the spread of disinformation. More than ever, we're seeing deception, propaganda, and fake news used as a weapon that's not only threatening democracy, but our basic human rights. As COVID-19, Trump election, and of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has shown us, media spaces are now being used as targets of political warfare. In this panel, we're going to delve into how information manipulation is on the rise, the emerging techniques of deception, and the battle countries, news organizations, and of course, the individual faces every day in disarming disinformation while also preserving media integrity. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce my wonderful panel. And we'll start with Michael Isikoff, who's sitting right next to me. He's Chief Investigative Correspondent of Yahoo News. He's been in the media industry for nearly 30 years. So he's been a correspondent for NBC, staff writer for Newsweek and The Washington Post. So great to have you, Michael. Welcome, Dominika Czozic, political journalist at Brussels TVP. She's an expert in European policy, defense and security issues, a woman of all trades. She's also written plenty of books herself, most recently Balkan Express. And of course, we can't forget our very own Yusuf Özhan, Deputy Director General and Editor-in-Chief of Anadolu Agency. Before that, he spent many years in various roles at TR2 World, but unfortunately, we've never actually met, so at least we get to do it on the big stage. So absolutely fantastic, great to have you as well. And finally, we have Anthony Gooch, Director of Public Affairs and Communications at the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Before that, he worked for the EU Commission in various roles over a period of 13 years. And Anthony, I was most excited to have you on the panel, mainly because on his Twitter profile, it's himself and the great Pele. And as Brazil is playing tonight, we'll get this panel started so we can all go home and watch that match. So Michael, I'm going to start with you. Of course, you're the co-writer of New York Times bestseller, Russian Roulette, the inside story of Putin's war on America and the election of Donald Trump. So in your professional opinion, to what extent does disinformation really pose a threat to democracies around the world?
Well, thank you, Charlotte, and it's great to be here. It is a serious, major, and ongoing threat. And we're not... Oh, there. How's this?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying it is a serious and ongoing threat. And I'll give you a little perspective from my own vantage point of when I first realized how serious a matter this was. Go back to 2016. We had the presidential election, and of course, that's when, as events unfolded that year, we learned more and more about what the Russians were doing to try to influence our election. There was the hacking of Democratic Party emails, the dumping of them through WikiLeaks on the eve of the Democratic Convention, blows up the Democratic Convention, a huge embarrassment for many in the party. The party chairwoman has to resign over it. But the snapshot I want to give you is from October of that year. Because on one day, October 7th, we learned the Obama administration confirmed for the first time that this was indeed the Russians who were interfering in our election. It was they who had hacked the emails. It was they who had provided them to Twitter. And it was a huge story, but it was overtaken by a bigger story that was released, that came out just an hour or so after the White House put out that statement, and that was the famous Access Hollywood tape in which Donald Trump is caught saying all sorts of raunchy things about what he wants to do to women if he had the opportunity to do so. In fact, how he talks about how he takes the opportunity to do so. And at that point, it looked like the election was effectively over. that there was no way Trump could recover from this. There were leading Republicans who were suggesting that his conduct on that tape was appalling. There were some calling on him to resign. And the very 2 days later, I flew to St. Louis for one of the debates between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, assuming that they were going to go through the motions, but the election was no longer in doubt. And on the cab ride from the airport in St. Louis to Washington University, where the debate was taking place, I'm talking to the cab driver, and it's a woman who she says, "Why are you here?" "I'm here for the debate." And she starts going on about Hillary Clinton and how she was responsible for multiple murders of her critics. And I listened and said, what are you referring to? And she started going down a list of supposed Clinton critics who had been murdered by the Clintons. And I pressed her, "Where are you getting all this? Where did you hear this?" She says, "Well, my husband told me." And I said, "Where did your husband hear this?" "Oh, it's on the internet. It's all over on Facebook. We saw the whole thing." And, that was the first, it hit me, oh my God, something is going on here that we in the mainstream media have not really picked up on. And because there's a whole group of people, voters out there, that are hearing stuff that is just demonstrably not true, that by any journalistic standard you wouldn't publish that.
So, Michael, you're saying that the general media haven't picked up on it. Dominika?
At that point. But that's when it hit home for me, and I realized, and I guess I realized it far more just about a month or so later when Donald Trump won the election, that this was a really big deal that we hadn't paid a lot of attention to, and we needed to.
And so leading on from that, Michael said we hadn't paid enough attention to it. How has that changed? And effective use of digital media in information wars is more important than ever. Dominika, what are your thoughts, and how can we achieve that?
Hello, merhaba. Many thanks for the invitation. I fully agree with what Michael told about this mechanism, because I observed this also in Poland. And let me give an example from the beginning of the war, of the aggression against Russia against Ukraine. It is this mechanism of rumors, what people used to say, and then other people repeat, and it is like massive fake news. In the first days of the Russian aggression against Ukraine in Poland, it was rumor that it will be not possible to take cash from the banks. And even my mother, who lives in Poland, in Krakow, I live in Brussels, she called me, and she's a very reasonable person, and she called me and she told, maybe I should take some cash, some money from bank, because it will be not allowed, it will be not possible, and we'll lose some, even small, but even money. And I told her, no, don't believe this. Who told you this? One of my colleagues, and who told her, and it was exactly the same mechanism. And of course, and I told to my mother, don't trust this. It is typical Russian manipulation to destabilize situation, internal situation in Poland, because Poland is one of the biggest advocates of Ukraine. And second example was exactly 1 day later, when people started to buy petrol and the petrol station, because they heard from someone that it will be not possible to buy petrol at the petrol station. And those two examples show how it is working, and what was the goal, of course, to destabilize country. Because when you will destabilize banking system, and when you will destabilize petrol station, you will be not able to buy petrol, it will block a country. And why? Because it was political reason, political target. Russia wanted to destabilize situation in Poland. But also, it was last year, exactly in November it started. Maybe you heard about this situation on the border between Poland and Belarus. that it was massive wave of migrants who wanted to enter to Poland from the Belarusian side. And it was many information in foreign media, even in Polish media, that Polish policemen, Polish soldiers are so brutal that it is against human rights, that they are beating innocent people, that Poland is building a fence on the border. But the fact was that it was long time prepared by Russia to also destabilize. It was already one of the first steps for the Russian invasion against Ukraine, to destabilize neighborhood, Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. And how they did this? With the help, of course, of Lukashenko regime, who is like a junior partner for Russia and for Putin. So they encourage people from Middle East, from Africa, people who wanted just to enter to Europe. They were innocent, they were victims in this situation, but they encouraged them, they even paid them, and they lied them. And go to Poland because, go to Belarus because border between Poland and Belarus is open, and when you, in Poland you will be welcome, and they will transfer you immediately to Germany, and then you will be in paradise. And many people believe in this, and it was, of course, Russian manipulation, Russian action to destabilize the situation in Poland. But in the European Parliament, it was, again, a big debate that in Poland there is no democracy, there is no rule of law, because Poland is building some fence on the border between Poland and Belarus. We had to protect our border because it is not only our Polish border, but it is external border of NATO and of the European Union. And we knew that those people who wanted to come, sometimes very aggressive, to Poland, they were also sometimes pushing, physically pushing by Belarusian soldiers. It was like checking of this, Russia wanted to check how stable, how strong is border between Poland and Belarus, so how strong is external border of the NATO and European Union. And that's why Poland had to protect this border. The same did Lithuania, and now Finland is building fence on the border between Finland and Belarus and Russia. So it was example how of the mechanism, and later on fake news, because some other media, without verifying, without checking, were repeating the same story. And Russia achieved goal, because first it was created bad atmosphere around some country, Poland, and later on Ukraine as well, because they told that Ukraine is involved in this process as well. And of course, they destabilize situation. So it is a very simple example. And you know, Goebbels, who was one of the most significant, of course, one of the most devil German politician, one of minister of propaganda in Hitler regime, Nazi, he used to say that if you will repeat lie 100 times, it will become true. And it is this mechanism, how it is working like. If you repeat something many, many times, people start to believe that it is true. And now, because of the social media, it is much more easy, because when you put something on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., when there is massive audience, it is distributed immediately.
That's a really interesting quote, Dominika. The more you repeat it, the more you believe it. And I think we've talked about the power that information warfare really has, but what are we actually fighting? You trade in information at your company, Anthony. How do you feel that threat from an organization standpoint?
Well, green for go. Just listening to you recount, 2016 I think was probably the wake-up call for us. So I work for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Turkey's been a founding member, and it's an organization that is very well known for providing trustworthy data and information. So it's the sort of place that you go, and I think many journalists go to, in order to know what's what. For us, if you like, the onset of a modern phenomenon which has always existed in human history. Let's be honest, post-truth, mis and disinformation is part of being human. The differences are that this has now gone turbo in a digitalized world. It spreads quicker than it's ever spread before, and to more people than it's ever spread before. So the consequences can be far, far graver. What we do, essentially, is provide evidence bases in order to develop the best standards of public policy that we can develop across the piece of policies. Education, health, economics, environment, climate, you name it, we're involved in it. And so you can imagine that when you have a situation like this arising, where actually it becomes almost unfashionable to seek the views of experts, or indeed to seek fact-based elements. And I'm not going to go into the reasons for that. There may be some reasons that some people would argue we had it coming, so to speak, notably because of the financial crisis in 2008. For us, this becomes a very problematic phenomenon. Now, it's a phenomenon that we see play out, I think, individually. All of us have to recognize our own behavior. We have a proclivity as human beings to like to be together with people who are a bit like us, who think similarly to us, not to be contradicting each other all the time and arguing all the time. That's often uncomfortable. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody in this room is like that, but it's a little bit of a human tendency. And now, on social media, again, it gets magnified and amplified, and you end up being in this sort of little world that you think is a world that everybody else inhabits, and it's your one. We also have to face up to the fact that there's a phenomenon that has emerged recently called news avoidance. And with Charlotte, we were commenting on this. News avoidance. People getting turned off news, essentially either because it's too complicated or it's too negative. And this is happening everywhere from Britain to Brazil. And it's doubled in the last 5 years, according to the Reuters Institute. We're talking at levels of 50% now. So we're in a situation which is a very challenging and difficult one. In that situation, what do we do? Because I think we're not fighters on the front line against disinformation. We're the people, in a sense, who people are fighting for, because we're producing the stuff, theoretically, that should be protected, that should be trustworthy, that should be objective, etc. The thing that we needed to do, I think with the onset of this situation back in 2016, when we were hit directly by it, notably in the context of the Brexit debate in the United Kingdom, when we produced economic analysis on the consequences of that prospective decision, was to actually say, to what extent is what we are doing accessible, relevant, appealing, in the way that other things that we're competing in a sense against are. And we can't compete against the fact that human nature prefers the salacious, the scandalous, and the controversial. So 6 times more stuff is circulated on social media that conforms to that, to stuff that is dry and boring. The thing is that what you do shouldn't be dry and boring. Don't make it dry and boring. I'll give you a couple of examples of what we did to try, if you like, and make our information be able to occupy a better space. First one, this actually was prior to 2016. It was an effort to put well-being at the center of policymaking. So well-being and quality of life being the thing that most of us care about, rather than an increase or a decrease in GDP, which unless you are very, very rich, you don't really notice it very much. It may trickle down. So we developed something called the Better Life Index, where you can go online and measure the performance of your elements of quality of life and well-being. Things that include stuff like your health, environment, education, sense of community, etc. But what we did was actually make it something that was really appealing and accessible. It was online. It's very colorful. If you go online, and I invite you to do so and visit it, it's something that makes you want to go there. It's actually designed around flowers. So like, your bees get attracted to it. And a critical thing that we did was actually ask you what you consider to be most important individually in your life in terms of well-being. So that's, if you like, an example of going beyond producing learned books of 500 pages that might be, and then when you get into the annexes, then it gets really scary. It's the sort of thing that people might not be immediately attracted towards. The second example I'd give you is one that happened with COVID. So we had frontline health workers, the people that we all owe an enormous debt to. But there was a lot of desire for information. And so we decided to try and fill the breach there in terms of frontline information provision for people who wanted to know, okay, hang on health policy, hospital beds, what's going on, what's happening in what countries, what is needed. And we took this everywhere into areas like tourism. A lot of people didn't know how important tourism was to all of our economies. And we started producing readily and easily accessible information, analysis and data done in a very bite-sized way so that you didn't have to have a PhD to be able to read it. You know, anyone could go in there and grab it. And what happened? Google put us right to the top of their search engine. We didn't pay any money. We don't have any money to pay for that stuff. But it was an example of if you do things a certain way, then you can earn your right maybe to be a very attractive proposition, but you certainly can't rest on your laurels.
Well, I want to just cut you in quite quickly. I want to go back to your point about news avoidance, which I find extremely interesting. Yusuf, in terms of Turkey and how the country deals with fake news, from your media standpoint, is a threat to the country as a whole. How has the global consumption of news changed in terms of the digital climate that we have at the moment? President Erdogan recently said that disinformation is one of the biggest challenges of the current period. How can the country tackle this issue?
Thank you. So, as the editor-in-chief of Anadolu, I need to just put that out very loud. Our institution, our organization, has been set up 2 years before the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, during the days of the War of Independence. And the very intrinsic values of Anadolu has that saying, confronting disinformation. Disinformation that was being passed around by the news agencies active at that time. So every Anadolu reporter has that very mission in the back of their minds. So right now, from where we stand, just as I outlined, in the digital era, the global consumption of news is being, of course, just as how our colleagues and the professionals have just outlined during their takes, is being interrupted very in a very non-stop way. So we are active in more than 100 countries. That puts a lot of responsibilities over our shoulders as well. As a news agency, which was set up as a traditional news organization, we are just enjoying our abilities of being on the ground with a lot of reporters. We've got 1,800 reporters. That gives us the upper hand as far as traditional news-making concerned. However, what we are speaking of is just an asymmetrical threat, which is actually making our stories, rendering our stories useless before even we publish them, because it's so fast that you cannot actually give a shape to the story. It's just going to be a completely, theoretically speaking, it's going to be a completely different world at the time when you will be publishing your story. So that's the challenge. That is what we are. That is the very reason why, after 102 years, decided to change the way how we look at the stories. So we are if you had decided to stay as a traditional news agency, you would just continue serving your customers, because you are doing a B2B business. Your customers are newspapers, television channels. However, we do not do that. We didn't do that. We decided to go also take the step further and be an outlet, to a certain extent, be an outlet for the public to reach at information. And we are taking pride in the very mission of actually passing along that information to the public as a whole, not only the Turkish-speaking countries, but in 13 different languages. So we are taking advantage of our traditional abilities. However, we took another step and decided to set up a verification desk. This is similar to what some other news agencies have also recently set up in their organizations. To be honest, a news agency shouldn't be bothering himself with verifying stories, but this is the world in which we are living. We have to catch up the speed of the world public without, if you had to wait for your story to be established, with a certain degree of accuracy and reliability, you would be spending your hours on the desk trying to untangle a web of a story which is not going to be taking you anywhere, maybe for the next 7 years, for the next 7 days, 10 days, because you are lacking integral parts of that story. But in the meantime, a network of decentralized discussion platforms are going to be shaping the narrative, and you would be simply not making a significant difference in people's imagination, which is actually putting our existence at risk too. So as a news agency, the verification desk is a team which was segregated from the main backbone of the organization. Their simple job is to consume as much fake news as possible. In order to understand what you are up against, you have to know what you're dealing with. The traditional news journal and news agency journalists are beasts. They're grinding the news agenda. They're doing this great because they're shaping your next day's imagination. Newspapers are your customers. They're going to be looking at your news agenda as well as other news agencies' news agenda. And they're going to be pulling out a stream. They're going to be pulling the headlines as well as their own very valuable journalists' input into that page, A1 cover page of their newspaper. But what I'm saying is still news agencies are providing 60% of the input of the broadcast journalism or print journalism. So whatever you are providing is still very valuable, but we have to be quick. We have to be quicker than those who are actually not making any attempt or as much attempt as we do to prove their stories. So our verification team is responsible for consuming fake news stories first, which is a very valuable pool of stories anyway, by the way, because not all these stories, unverified stories, are fake. Yep. Some of them are also story pitches, which is helping you make yourself relevant with the public, which is moving at 200 miles per hour, whereas you are just moving like a turtle on that ground.
Well, you're talking about the unchanging environment of news agencies, but I mean, at the end of the day, disinformation is not a new thing. It's been around and part of society for a very long time, decades even. So why have we seen a sharp increase in the last decade? Why now, Michael?
Social media. It's as simple as that. I mean, yeah, the example I started with, the Hillary Clinton murders people, that was not a new theme for fringe far-right figures. You know, during the 1990s, when Bill Clinton was president, I heard this quite a bit. The difference was it was on obscure fringe newsletters or, you know, bulletin boards. You know, this is well before the advent of the social media giants, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter. But once that came in, this kind of sort of garbage information was circulating far more rapidly, reaching far more people than it had before. And that was really the break point in which this became a plague that all of us had to deal with. But all that said, this is a vexing issue. Charlotte, you used the phrase fake news. We were just talking about fake news. But look, one person's fake news is another person's legitimate news. When Donald Trump was president, every story he didn't like, he would call it fake news. And the phrase caught on, so much so that in February of 2017, I had an opportunity to go to Damascus and interview Assad, and I confronted him with evidence of the atrocities of his regime, torturing dissidents, burying their bodies. There were photographs of emaciated bodies that had been smuggled out of Syria, and I actually gave it to him and said, please explain this. How do you justify what your regime is doing? And what did he say? It's fake news. Fake news. He was adopting the language of Donald Trump. which he had been using to criticize the press. That was an eye-opening moment for me, too, to see how this kind of phrase uses. And so, you know, this is not an easy question. Right now, I don't know how many of you have been following what's going on with Elon Musk and Twitter right now, but he's been releasing all sorts of internal emails and documents to sympathetic journalists who are writing about how Twitter was suppressing stories from conservatives. And of course, the prime example that's become a kind of a flashpoint in US politics of late is the Hunter Biden laptop story. New York Post, in the closing weeks of the 2020 presidential election, publishes a story about the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop. There are all sorts of questions about how this laptop, you know, emerged, how it got into the hands of Rudy Giuliani, who gives it to the New York Post to begin with. But Twitter restricts access to it. Takes the New York Post's Twitter handle down for a couple of weeks, restricts access to the information, and you know, the claim was, you know, the Biden campaign was pushing the idea that this was all Russian disinformation. In fact, they got 50 former US intelligence officials, all of whom were pretty much in the Biden camp, to write a letter saying this has all the hallmarks of Russian disinformation and you, mainstream media, should drop it. So, what should one take away from all this? Look, there were legitimate questions about the Hunter Biden laptop. On the other hand, there was no evidence it was Russian disinformation. The claims that the contents of the laptop were faked have proven not to be the case. And, you know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, in subsequent reporting 2 years later, has pretty much verified that the emails, many of the emails, the provocative emails, were in fact real emails. So now there's a consensus that Twitter did the wrong thing when it took down the stories about the Hunter Biden laptop in the last few weeks of the campaign. How significant were they? Would they have changed the result of the election? Look, it's the president, it was the candidate's son, not the candidate himself. There are all sorts of questions about whether it implicated anything about Joe Biden or not. But as a press guy, as a longtime believer in freedom of the press, I don't like what is being called content moderation these days. That's another phrase for censorship. So while I think disinformation is, as I said, a plague that we have to confront, the idea of a government or a huge social media company deciding what I can or cannot read is also offensive to me.
So how do you counteract that idea on social media? As Michael just said, a platform where freedom of speech is at the center. How do you balance that, Dominika?
It is one of the crucial questions for all of us, how to balance this. Balance from the one side freedom of expression, and from the other side reality and freedom to the right to be fair. Right to defend truth. It's, of course, sometimes it's very difficult to judge what is fake news, what is true, because especially when we are also not only journalists, but we are also audience part, and we don't know exactly the situation in central countries. We are following other journalists, other media, and as we don't know the real situation, it's very difficult for us to judge what is fake news, what is reality. But from the other side, when you know that something is really lie, even not fake news, but just ordinary lie, it's very difficult to fight with this, because it's very easy to blame someone or some country to make dark black from on the white paper, and in contrary, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to say that someone who was accused about something is really innocent. It is always like when there is some article, some reportage with accusing someone, and later on it is verified that it was not true, and there is another article, another reportage defending this person and explaining the situation. No one take care about this, because it's very people take attention first, and then if there is verification that we are sorry, but we are accusing someone who was innocent, no one is reading this. Almost no one. Maybe only this person who was the protagonist of this. But you ask why why now there are so many fake news, and why it happens so massive now. I think that because of the time. Now we live in the time of turbulence, time of change, global change. We faced COVID pandemic. We now facing war in Ukraine. And it is sort of transition time when there is new world order. Sorry for this expression, but that's true. And when there is big change, there is a big chaos as well. And many sources, many countries, but not only countries, are using this situation to benefit and to destabilize the situation. That's why now we are facing even more fake news than before. And of course, it wouldn't be possible without social media, because with traditional media, it was much smaller size. With social media, it is on massive and huge scale.
So Dominika, in order to adapt to these changes, as you just mentioned, what needs to happen, Yusuf, to advance? Do the government need to get more involved and have more regulations and laws than they already have? And are the ones that are already in place effective?
I mean, the entire media, not only news agencies, but also broadcast journalism and print journalism, has to evolve in certain direction. That's true. But before that, we have to decide that evolution is either going to be in line with the people's expectations or against their expectations. So, for example, as Mr. Isikoff mentioned about the Hunter Biden story, the public was actually attacking the technology companies at the time for restricting the link of the story, which was actually making it impossible for anyone to share the story, as well as the elite newspapers of the US and some of the television networks, because they have purposefully decided to abandon the story altogether, not even mentioning about it, and then just posting some articles about why they actually ignored the story. And there were some lines, because it was just about 2 weeks before the elections, and it was going to be a part of the Russian disinformation campaign, which could have ended up in swaying the public opinion in the direction of one of the candidates. So actually the public was during the days when Hunter Biden emails were being discussed in the US, the public was expecting the whole media to evolve itself, adapt itself in their own version of their worldview. So in my opinion, news agencies or the entire media need to evolve itself. That's true, we have to adapt. We cannot be as quick or as fast as the public chatter around. That's true, because we've got our own journalism standards. And that standards implementing that standards into your article is a costly business. It takes time. It's a complex thing, and not all the stories can be written with just 2 lines there. So you have to be evolving, but you have to build the trust with the audience as well. That needs to be you have to put a lot of emphasis on actually building the trust of the public too. Because if we do not attempt to garner their support from the public again, someone else is going to be doing just that.
You say we've got
going to be helping the media organizations around the world to produce stories that change people's lives in the right direction. So news organizations cannot easily abandon the fact that public also shapes the structure of the news organizations itself because of the, I mean, look at the last 10 or 20 years. Many of the news organizations have laid off thousands of people. And these people practically moved either to PR business or just quit the entire industry altogether. Because of the fact that the financial structure of the news organizations have gone down. People weren't paying for our service.
You say you've got to build that trust with the general public, the citizen. How do we actually do that, Anthony? Do we need more rights to protect the reader, the viewer?
Look, I'm going to come to that, but one of the things I wanted maybe to address, if we're going to project forward, I think one of the things that we may need to do, it's not easy right now, and I agree very much with what Domenica's said and Michael, there's acceleration, amplification, and it's a very, very difficult moment right now. To deal with any problem, you have to unpack it, and I think one of the things that we need to focus on is distinguishing and defining. We tend to package together a lot of different concepts. Misinformation is different to disinformation. Propaganda is different. Satire, and this is a very important element. Many of our societies, we love humor. And we know that humor involves exaggeration. We know it involves saying things that aren't quite true, but we all smile when that happens, and that's all okay. And I think that we have to be a little bit careful when we look at these questions to actually define what it is that we mean in order to be able to address it in a particular way. And I think there, the important thing is to identify what, say, the information spreader's intent to cause harm is. What is the intent that there is there? And also, what is the degree of fabrication that is involved? Now, this stuff may sound a little bit, how can I put it, intellectual, but I think you've got to break things down from this perspective. Now, the second element also is preventive. Now, we've talked about pandemics. There's also an infodemic. The WHO talked about an infodemic around the pandemic, particularly around the issue of vaccinations. Now, we know that issue was there beforehand. Many countries in the OECD, many rich countries, developed countries, people weren't getting vaccinated. Their kids weren't getting vaccinated because a lot of stories were going around regarding the impact of vaccines. And so this was already present. A very important element in all of this is, if you like, the equivalent of vaccination in a pandemic is education. There's a hell of a lot to do in that domain. Now, the OECD is very well known for its standard-setting work on education, but it's also worrying for us because in our latest PISA assessment of standards in secondary education, we've realized that only 50% of kids within the 40 OECD countries are able to distinguish between subjective news elements and objective news elements. So there's a huge amount to do in terms of teaching critical thinking, teaching to be able to exercise your judgment and the bases upon which to do that. Okay, so let's say you've defined, and let's say you've educated. Is that enough? On a personal level, I would say that I was really struck by reading The Origin of Consumer Rights, which is actually quite recent. I think it's the 1970s or the late 60s, JFK speech. And for fun, I just replaced the word consumer with voter rights. And thinking, wow, this reads really well. What if you were to think about, very carefully you'd have to think about it, but surely in very important moments in our democracies like elections or referenda, in the same way that we all have recourse as consumers if a product or a service is misrepresented or if it's lied about, and that can result in civil and criminal proceedings against companies, if it is proven that is taking place in very important moments for our societies, as are elections or referenda, that there be recourse for voters or for citizens in those situations. So some element of lack of impunity, because right now, otherwise, I get what Michael said, freedom of speech. The problem is it's used as freedom to lie too often. And that's an issue of balance as well that we need to grapple with.
I think that's a really interesting point, freedom. Sorry, do you want to quickly, we're just about to wrap up, but one last word from you, Michael.
A couple of points on that. look, yes, freedom of speech means freedom to say things that you don't like, that you don't agree with, that you think is fake news. That's just the nature of what freedom of speech is. As I understand it, the problem for why this has become so egregious with social media is that these social media companies are protected. In the US law, we have something called Section 230, which basically gives them protection from anything they publish, that they are not publishers who could be sued for defamation the way, my news organization can, yours, others can. They are merely, platforms for others to engage in speech. So I'll give you, what I thought was a particularly egregious example of this. Again, I hate to keep bringing up Donald Trump, but he went on a tear a few years ago as president, where he didn't like what a media commentator, Joe Scarborough, was saying about him. He was being quite critical, and Trump starts tweeting about how Joe Scarborough had murdered a woman staffer of his 20 years earlier, suggesting he had an affair with her. It was about to become public, and Joe Scarborough had her murdered, assassinated. There was absolutely nothing to back any of this up, right? I mean, the staffer had died of natural causes. There was no suspicion of foul play. Joe Scarborough was nowhere near her. She was in Florida. He was in Washington at the time of her death. There was just nothing to back it all up. And I talked to Scarborough about it. And he said, look, I can't do anything about this because I can't sue him because of Section 230 under the Communications Act in the United States. So I think that's the direction I would like things to go. I very much recoil, at the suggestion, do we need more government regulation? No, we do not. Governments have historically been the suppressors of free speech, the suppressors of truth in order to sustain their own regimes. So keep the government out of it, but we can change the laws that do give consumers more recourse to challenge what is being circulated.
Well, it's certainly a challenge going forward and how we deal with the fake news. Thank you. That's all we have time for. But as Ali Jan said in the previous session, this is the dawn of a new age. And thank you so much for listening, guests. We've had an amazing, great session, and see you next year.